All right, our next panel will unpack the rise of China as an economic power and dive into how China's trade policies are affecting the international arena. Please join me in welcoming our discussion leader, Damien Ma, Managing Director at Paulson Institute, Mary Lovely, Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and Jamieson Greer, International Trade Partner at King & Spalding. Please give them a warm welcome.
Can you all hear me? Okay, great. The mic is working. First good sign. Well, it's great to be here in Utah. It's great to be with all of you this morning. I have the enviable duty of wearing two hats today, so don't get confused. I'm both the moderator and also going to be responding to some questions, so don't get confused if I'm going to throw some questions to our very distinguished panelists, Mary and Jamieson, this morning. So you've heard a lot about Chinese politics this morning, about Xi Jinping, and you've heard a lot about our foreign policy from both ambassadors, current and former. So I think it's only natural that we get to the Chinese economy as the natural follow-up. And so this is something that I think probably will have more business relevance as well. And I think it is certainly something that even if we're not thinking about it every single day, I'm sure every one of you in this room has more than one made in China product. I can ask you what your favorite made in China product is, and most of you might say the iPhone. But when I'm asked that question, I always say my parents are my favorite made in China product. So that'll give you a little bit about my own bio, I suppose. But I think that's one way in which we actually really interact with the Chinese economy. And we're going to be talking about trade and goods, and so I think that's something we really want to be thinking a lot more about. And I always like to say, even if your business or even if you have nothing to do with China, don't worry, China's going to be able to find you, because it is a $15 trillion economy. And it is about now 70% of the U.S. GDP. The only other country that's made it to 70% of U.S. GDP was Japan back in 1995. And after that, the property bubble burst, and Japan went through its last decade of stagnation. It's never gotten above 70% of U.S. GDP. In fact, it's quite a bit smaller now. China is really only getting started. China right now is only at $12,000 per capita GDP. That is technically considered high income by World Bank definitions, so China has made it into high income, but it's also really important to remember, as the premier of China, Li Keqiang, always says, there are also 600 million Chinese living on $150 a month. So that's $5 a day. So China may have lifted 1 billion people out of poverty over the last 35 years, extreme testament to its success. There's still 600 million people, twice the population of the United States, living on $5 a day. So economically, it's a bit of a walking paradox. On one extreme, you tend to see commentary and news saying it's sort of an unstoppable economic juggernaut. On the other hand, you have still a very significant poor population, relatively poor population. I'm reminded that oftentimes, sometimes our Chinese interlocutors would say, you Americans always, when you think about China, you think of everything divided by 1.4 billion, but he's like, my problem every single day is how to divide everything by 1.4 billion. So the big denominator issue is actually a big challenge for the Chinese government. That's what they stay up thinking about, rather than sort of everything multiplied by 1.4 billion. So before I get to asking Mary and Jamieson about the Chinese economy, both the near term and the medium and long term, and how we got into, the trade war of the last few years that I guess is still ongoing, I want to just briefly set the scene about how the Chinese economy got to where it is today. Just very briefly, because I think you hear a lot about the Chinese miracle, whether you agree with that metaphor or not. Let me unpack sort of the key ingredients of what made the Chinese miracle work. And essentially, the economy you see today was basically formed in 1978. Before that, that was the Mao era. There was barely any economic growth. It was all politics. So for all intents and purposes, the Chinese economy started 40 years ago. In 1978, when Deng Xiaoping launched reform and opening up. Now, it's important to understand there's both a reform side of it and there was an opening side of it. Both of those interacted together to make the miracle happen. The reform side was essentially really getting rid of a very, very big and strong state sector. That was the big thing that China did starting in the early and then went into the late 1990s. They had 40 million people laid off from state-owned enterprises. They broke what was called the Iron Rice Bowl, meaning guaranteed work. That was the state model. And they were willing to tolerate 40 million unemployed to get rid of the state sector. Now you've heard a lot about the state sector. All you hear sometimes are state firms. But in reality, there are fewer than 100 centrally owned state firms in China. Right? They're powerful, they're huge, and they're very politically powerful. They absolutely matter, but let's be clear about the scale. There are fewer than 100 centrally state-owned enterprises. Those are the companies that you hear about a lot. And so, so when the state sector got out of the way, the engine of growth has been the private sector. Vice Premier Liu He, who was the top economic advisor to President Xi, and I think someone that Jamieson knows quite well because he was also leading leading the Chinese side of trade negotiations. He likes to describe the private sector this way. He has the 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 formula. What does that mean? The private sector is 50%, more than 50% of employment, or I'm sorry, more than 50% of tax revenue in China, more than 60% of GDP, more than 70% of innovative output, more than 80% of urban unemployment, and more than 90% of total enterprises. So that's the private sector. That was, China's miracle was driven not by the state sector, but by the private sector. And it's still one of the most dynamic, despite what's been happening in terms of a bit of a reversal into more of a state-owned model. The second piece of the miracle formula, if there is a recipe, it was the opening piece. And that had to do with the creation of what Deng Xiaoping called special economic zones. These essentially were big laboratories for capitalism. You could do pretty much whatever you wanted in those zones. They didn't want it around the country, but they wanted to see if some of these experimental zones would succeed. And the OG SEZ, Special Economic Zone, is Shenzhen, right? 35 years ago, it was a swamp. Today, it's China's Silicon Valley. All the big tech companies you hear about, Tencent, Alibaba, so on and so on. Well, Alibaba's not there, but Tencent and Xiaomi and all those companies are in the Silicon Delta, in the Silicon Valley. So it's an enormous success of the SEZ model. Again, it was just a laboratory to see if capitalism could thrive, entrepreneurship could thrive, and competition could thrive, and it did. And it's no surprise that when you talk about trade and manufacturing, iPhones, a lot of that is coming from that particular area. Just to give you a sense of that area is about 150 million people, right, that delta. It's larger than Mexico. So when you think about the economic impact of that particular delta, it's like thinking about Mexico. So that's the appropriate analogy. So opening up is SEZs, and then also state sector getting out of the way. And finally, there was state involvement. But let's not get carried away with industrial policy. We're going to talk about that later today, but we've heard a lot about that. But that's a playbook that the Japanese did, that the South Koreans did. They all did industrial policy. China had a more muscular industrial policy. They had ministries that focused a lot on it. But let me give you an example of one of the ways in which China practiced industrial policy. So one of the former minister who ran the Ministry of Science and Technology, he was actually the only non-Communist Party member at the minister level at the time in 2005 or 2006. He actually grew up in the auto sector, and he worked for German companies. So he was a single guy pushing China to build EVs. He thought China's future laid in electric vehicles. This was back in 2005. He was a single guy that pushed China, and then they started coming out with all these plans. Well, now you look at the EV industry in China, that's what happened. That's one example of industrial policy. So now the state sector, again, it's never going to go away. We're going to have to deal with the Chinese state sector. It's politically powerful. It's going to be there. But let's not mistake it as sort of the most important part of the Chinese economy, because it is not. Numbers-wise, dynamism-wise, profit-wise, I can show you all kinds of data, which I'm not going to bore you with today, but the private sector is by far the engine of growth. The way to think about An easy analogy, if you'll bear with me for just 30 seconds, if you think of the Chinese economy as a car, if you reverse engineer that car, what are the key pieces of that car? Well, the state sector would be the shock absorber. So when there are down cycles, the government can tell the state sector, well, let's increase supply in steel, cement, or what have you, and that's going to perhaps mitigate inflation. Or sometimes it will tell state sector to buy things when there's lack of demand. So it's almost an instrument of fiscal policy. It's the shock absorber in economic cycles. The private sector would be the engine of the car. It would be the growth engine. And the Communist Party, well, it likes to think it's the steering wheel, and sometimes it steers it into some wrong directions, but basically that's how that system works. And that's where we're at today. But we're seeing cracks in the current China model. I don't think I'm exaggerating to say that even the Chinese government recognizes it, and I think we're going to get to a lot of that about what are some of the constraints on the Chinese economy, both in the near term and also in the longer term, and also how U.S. China economic tensions kind of factors into the economic picture. So Mary, let's begin with what's happening now, I suppose, because zero COVID is obviously still weighing on everyone's minds. And Shanghai has come out of the lockdown, but the economy is certainly not looking up. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what you think is happening there and what we might be seeing in the Chinese economy in the next, let's say, 6 months.
Okay. Think you can all hear me? Yeah, thanks, Damien. Thanks for that great little review. So we've all known about zero COVID. We read about it in the newspaper. We think, I'm glad I'm not being locked down, right? But we have to remember there are three big fears. One is the fact that there's a lot of elderly, particularly in Shanghai. The elderly are under-vaccinated, and we know that elderly are very vulnerable. Certainly, we've seen it here in the United States. And lastly, the healthcare system in China is incompletely developed. So a very big surge of COVID could quickly overwhelm the system. Also, the vaccines, frankly, are untested fully against Omicron. So people say Omicron's not a big deal, but we don't know that in the Chinese context. And that's something that the Chinese leadership has decided is their priority, is avoiding that. So we have to acknowledge that there is a real fear behind what's going on with the zero COVID policy. The zero COVID policy after the initial waves of COVID was meant to be more dynamic, more flexible. We were going to come in almost with a strike team and get it down. That didn't work, and we know why. Omicron is a different animal, right? It's very hard to prevent transmission, as all of us are finding, double vaxxed, double boosted, and still you find people come to an event like this and they end up with, hope not, COVID. So we know that it's not beat, it can't be beat, and so we're going to continue to see these lockdowns. How big they are, we don't know. The virus is in control. What does that mean in the short run? In the short run, that means that we're going to continue to see the Chinese economy dampened by this threat. So we're going to see production shortages. We're going to see a lot of dislocation of people. We're going to see that as well at the global level. It takes time for goods to get from China to the U.S., and so we're likely to see shortages moving forward for things that happened 2 weeks or a month or 6 weeks ago. So we're going to continue to see sporadic shortages. And when we look at the Yangtze River Delta, is an incredible amount of global production located there. And of course, the way you become very productive is to locate a lot of production in one area. You have an ecosystem. And so that area locked down has enormous implications for very specific types of activities. So it's going to have a short-run effect on China and then effect on the global economy. Medium term, looking a little bit farther out, knowing we're going to play this like whack-a-mole game for a while, what's the impact? I think on China, it's going to make it more difficult for the Chinese authorities to try to stimulate the economy, something they're doing now. They've come forward with a multi-point plan. How do you get people to consume when they think, okay, once I've restocked my shelves, I'm going to keep them stocked, but I'm going to hold on to a lot of precautionary saving because I could be out of work for an extended period of time. So they're going to have trouble stimulating the consumption-led growth that they want. And secondly, on the global sphere, we're going to see businesses are reluctant to invest, not knowing what is likely to happen in the near term. So we're going to have, in a sense, a set of paralysis, and I think it's going to be at a much lower level of economic activity than was predicted even at the end of 2021.
And not to mention that the property sector hasn't been doing too well going into COVID lockdowns. And for those who have some passing knowledge of the Chinese economy, the property sector is enormous. It's roughly sales are about total property sales is about 15% of Chinese GDP, which is staggering. And so anytime you have a slowdown there, it's going to have knock-on effects on commodities, on steel, cement, all heavy industry. And couple that with COVID, in the near term, the economic outlook is just, there's not going to be good news. And so the key question is, how do they bounce back from that? And I think you made a really interesting point, and it's been actually remarkable how little they've stimulated, given the a potential economic crisis. And we can go into some reasons why, but part of it is I think they're actually constrained when our Federal Reserve is heading into a very aggressive tightening cycle. They're very reluctant to stimulate too much, especially monetarily, because that's going to lead to capital outflows. And they're terrified of that because they had a really bad experience in 2015 with enormous capital outflows. They had to spend upwards of $1 trillion in foreign exchange reserves just to prevent that, that crisis. So the Central Bank of China is essentially in a rock and a hard place. They can't stimulate that much because of the Fed. And they're just going to have to, I think, see how far the economy goes in the near term and see how it bounces back up in the third or fourth quarter. So that really is not a great picture if you're tracking Chinese growth in the near term. But let's go back to talk a little bit more about sort of thinking about medium to long-term prospects, right? China, it's 2022. I think you heard earlier that China basically does want to become probably the world's biggest economy by 2035. That's essentially the economic goal if you think about President Xi Jinping's medium-term plans, which they released alongside the 14th five-year plan this time. So they released a midterm 2035 plan and a 14th five-year plan. And the midterm plan goes to 2035. And there, essentially, if you read it closely, it means essentially doubling their GDP from a few years ago, which, depending on how you forecast growth rates, that would put China slightly above the United States by 2035. I guess just sort of out of the box question, what do you think the average American's reaction would be if every single newspaper in 2035 started blasting China, now the world's largest economy, surpassing the United States? Jamieson, what do you think?
Oh, well, I think that depends. I think even now, when you look at the paper, by terms of purchasing power parity, which is one measure of GDP, China, in some senses, is already larger. So I think there's already deep concern in the United States about China's economic position. And I think in 2035, if there's not some kind of normalization in Chinese economic and trade practices, that's a long time from now. There's a lot of things that can happen between now and then.
Yes.
And unfortunately, I'm somewhat pessimistic. And I think things will probably get a little worse before they get better. I think it's important for everyone to understand, and for this conversation, that China is not a free market country. It's not a free market economy. It's really important to know that. So when we're talking about private sector versus state-owned, we need to understand what that means, because there are certainly specific state-owned entities, but there's also state influence, right? Where you have a situation where you can have the leader of the biggest tech company in the country be brought before Chinese government authorities, where you can have an IPO for a major tech company be unwound and halted. That's not a state-owned company, but it's the state directing it. So it's not a market-driven economy. So it's really important to understand that. And it's also really important not to impose, Western views of how we would approach a COVID-19 crisis or a production and supply crunch, because some of the things that are undergirding the economic decisions in China are, how can the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, retain control? How can Xi Jinping retain control? How can we continue to employ this huge demographic that we have, and we have to continue employing? If it's something that's going to create overcapacity, if we're going to take stimulus measures that double down on our real estate where we have excess real estate capacity, if it's going to double down on manufacturing where we have excess manufacturing capacity, they will do that. And I mean, they've announced that. I mean, part of their 33-point plan for stimulus is to help continue to bail out their real estate sector, which is suffering, and there's more real estate, and there's a lot of money tied up in that. It's also important, I think, to understand the role of traded goods and services in the Chinese economy. If you look at the U.S. economy over the last 20 years, trade makes up about 20% of our GDP, and that's been pretty standard. If you look at China over the last 20 years, trade has made up anywhere between 1/3 to 2/3 of their GDP. That's a huge amount. So that means they're really dependent on trade. And when you talk, Damien, about how did they get there, and you talk about from 1978 on, what did they do and the different measures that they took, we also have to understand again that there were when you say industrial policy, I mean, if you unpack that, what does that mean? It means subsidies. So there might not be state-owned entities, but there are state subsidies given to national champions, right? There's a policy of import substitution where we want to have as much domestic production as possible in China and import as little as possible as we can from other places. We've heard about IP theft. I mean, Governor Huntsman, who you heard earlier, was the chair of a commission that talked about IP theft from American companies. And so this is not a free market economy. Their solutions going forward are not going to be free market solutions. And even though maybe that's what we would want them to do or think they should do, that's not going to be the case. It's going to affect anyone who's doing business in China or with China, and we should be really clear-eyed about it.
So I think Jamieson's absolutely right. China is not a free market in the Milton Friedman sense of a free market, and I don't think it'll ever become that. In fact, in the 1980s, when China was reforming and opening up, Milton Friedman went to China. That's the famous Chicago economist that's synonymous with free market principles. He went there and he tried to advise China on having a free market, and the Chinese basically said, "That's nice, but no thanks." And so they didn't go completely free market, but it's also hard to deny how much the economy has been liberalized, everything from prices to basically, large swaths of the Chinese economy. And I think, one thing I think a slight wrinkle to Jamieson's point too is that if you look at China relative to other countries at a similar stage of development like Japan and South Korea, earlier on, China is actually a much more open economy to foreign investment than those economies were back when they were developing. But let's, since we're talking about we talk a little bit about the near term, which is a pretty abysmal outlook. Let's pivot to maybe not 2035, but what do you think are some of the constraints for the Chinese economy as they try to shift their growth model from what Jamieson kind of outlined, overinvestment in property, overinvestment, they have a lot of debt in the economy, you hear a lot about that. I mentioned sort of Japan, got to 70%, and then it sort of faded away economically relative to the United States. Are we looking at something like that? What's sort of your view on the middle income trap idea? Maybe you can describe to the audience what that is economically.
Okay. So first I would say that I have to respectfully disagree with my friend Jamieson. I think that the economy is largely freed. It's a market where many of the entrepreneurs, the private sector, make their decisions based on prices and demand and supply. It's an economy that has a much heavier state hand than we do in the United States, so it's not our model. But we have to be clear about what it is. It has developed, you cannot create the kind of wealth that have been created in the last 40 years without freeing the market. That has been the genius of the economy. It's been very rapid entry and exit, letting bad firms die that have driven the productivity of Chinese firms. And we have very, very detailed studies of this based on, hundreds of thousands of Chinese companies. So I'm not just making this up. We can study it. They respond to economic impulses in the way that we would predict. That doesn't mean that there isn't an important role for the state, but in my view, it's very important that we get this reality right, because another thing that Ambassador Burns said was, we're trying to protect American businesses, protect American national security, American interests more broadly. And that requires us to have a very clear-eyed view based on facts on the ground. So can't be hysterical, we can't overestimate and we have to understand what are the constraints of the Chinese leadership. What are their fears so that we can anticipate what they're going to do and also how they're going to respond to our moves. A lot of their move towards self-sufficiency was a desire to be free of coercion, what they see as coercion from the West. And yes, of course, the economic sanctions that we have levied on Russia scare them because that's what they fear. They're not at the stage where they can go it alone. They know that. Looking ahead, what are their key issues? This is very important for us to understand. You know, one of the first things you learn in sort of, you know, game theory, war theory is know what the adversary is thinking. What are the adversary's goals and constraints? First of all, the middle income trap. Middle income says, you know, a country that's and China is basically a middle income country. It's not a high income country. Yeah.
Barely.
Yeah, and it's got this tremendous problem with inequality. Their Gini coefficient, a measure of inequality, is the same as ours. So, you know, it's an economy where you can get the most luxurious luxury suite and food and fanciest cars to one where people are basically having trouble, you know, surviving because of food insecurity.
$5 a day.
So, you know, they have to move this economy forward. The party needs to provide this type of growth for their legitimacy. How do they do that? What is some of the main challenges? I would say we can see a lot. One is they need new governance tools. So they have relied, you know, early on in my career, people said, you know, in China, fiscal policy is monetary policy. Mm-hmm. Now they find they can't move on monetary policy. What about fiscal? Well, why can't they provide income supports? They don't have the kind of social supports for their people. You didn't see them doing the gigantic stimulus that we did in the United States, which, for better or worse, how you feel about its contribution to inflation, you have to say it got a lot of people through a very difficult time in this country, which was the our own COVID experience. They don't have those supports. So you have a lot of people who have very high savings because they know that they're just, you know, one illness away from being destitute. How do you get those people to be the drivers of the economy? Last year, and when China performed well, its main drivers were net exports and investment. Those are going to fail it this year, and yet they don't have the tools to really make the shift that they've been trying to make for, 10 years to consumption-driven economy, maybe more, right? So that's a big problem for them. Second, of course, is their labor force. They want to be us, right? They want to be an economy that has workers that can go in, be literate, numerate. Yes, they are producing, but they still have a very low level of high school graduates. They now are having trouble absorbing the millions of new college graduates. Damien and I were talking this morning.
Yes, 18%.
18% urban unemployment among youth. This is a huge problem, not only for keeping the economy moving, but also for social stability. So how do they take a system where you have many people in rural areas, substandard education levels, and say, you're going to be part of this global economy. You're going to be working with computers, right? When they're having trouble even doing basic maths. This is a huge problem for them. Another problem, of course, is this idea of why are they drilling down so much on indigenous technology and manufacturing? Productivity, baby. They got to keep the productivity growth going. And their productivity growth has tanked. Why? Partly it is the state. The state has taken a bigger role in directing investment. The state is directing investment not toward the thing that's going to create the most wealth, but the thing that's politically expedient or a political need. And so that has been driving down productivity, misallocation of capital, other types of strong hand of the state. So their miracle growth has really slowed. And how do they revive it? It's going to come through creating a better workforce. That's a huge problem. Think about the problems we have in our own society with improving rural education, urban education, providing health care to people, providing supports for people in old age. Don't forget, it's aging much more rapidly than the United States. So these are all the kind of existential problems that are on the menu for the leadership. And I think the U.S. has to study those carefully, understand what the problems are, and then confront the Chinese on the things we rightly say, no, foul, not going to participate, but understand how we can offer solutions or be part of the solution to the things they really do have to deal with.
And I would say on the demographic point, and you may have mentioned it and I missed it, their demographics are really changing where they are going to have a rapidly aging population, but they do not have a younger population to sustain and support that older population. And so that's going to be, I think, a big challenge for them. How are we going to deal with welfare type issues for this aging population when our labor base is actually smaller than it was? So that's going to be a big issue. The other thing is, on the long term, what are they going to do about trade relations with the West? I think we'll get into this in a little bit. But right now, the United States and Western allies have imposed significant export controls, prohibiting the export of certain technologies and items and software and things like that to China. You're probably all well aware that the United States has substantial tariffs on Chinese imports. The United States controls and scrutinizes investment from China. There is talk in the United States, more than talk, there's a bill in Congress right now suggesting that we need to be scrutinizing outbound investment to China. And for a country whose GDP is 33% made up of trade, this is significant. And so how are they going to, what are they going to do, right? I mean, are they going to change some of these non-market unfair trade practices that the US and other countries are rightly concerned with, and maybe find a way to ease those trade tensions? I mean, right now we're in a little bit of a freeze with those kinds of measures, it seems. It doesn't seem to me, based on my interactions when I was in the government with the Chinese helping negotiate the Phase 1 agreement, when we suggested, hey, here are some ways that you can change these trading practices and maybe we can come closer together, the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, was not open to doing that. And so we had a Phase 1 agreement, which suggests that there's a lot more out there that would need to be fixed.
That's a really excellent point. And if I can just quickly summarize, and we're going to actually get back to the trade issue momentarily, but in terms of medium-term challenges, Mary and both Jamieson brought up some really important issues. And if I could summarize, for the sake of simplicity, I call them the 3 Ds, I would say, are the key constraints on the Chinese economy: debt, demographics, and distribution, meaning wealth distribution, right? So the 3 Ds, if you take away anything, debt, China's at 264% to GDP debt to GDP ratio, which is quite high. It's not as high as certain developed markets, but for a country of that stage of development, it's quite high. And that's also one of the reasons why it doesn't want to stimulate, because to the extent it stimulates, you can bolster GDP, but that debt ratio is going to go up too, right? So they have to make a choice. Do we care about the GDP target anymore? Do we care about bringing down the debt to GDP ratio target? And right now, it's the debt to GDP ratio target that matters a lot more. So they're not stimulating. They want to control financial risk. Demographics, absolutely. Over the last 10 years, China's working age population has shrunk by 5 percentage points just in 10 years. It's increasingly moving to Japan levels of an aging society. And for those who don't know, China has an extraordinarily low retirement age, 60 years old for men and 55 years old for women. And so that's sort of the mandate. And so they exited workforce quite a bit earlier than other countries. And so that's a big problem. And we haven't gotten to the one-child issue where basically you have one kid supporting 2 parents and 4 grandparents. So you have an inverted pyramid problem when it comes to entitlements and pensions. And the Chinese call it the 4-2-1 problem. That's a huge problem. And finally, Marriott mentioned redistribution. Distribution of wealth, inequality. There's such concentration of wealth in the deltas, and where all the companies are, where all the where the provinces are doing really, really well, but you go further out to the hinterlands, not doing so well. And then when you hear things about ghost cities and empty apartments, that's where they are, in those hinterland provinces. So debt, distribution, and demographics are kind of the key constraints on the Chinese economy. And so they've done really well, catching up to 70% of US GDP. The next 30% is going to require a fundamentally different economic model, and we're seeing that shift in real time. And it's going to be disruptive, and it's not going to be easy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I was talking about in terms of new governance tools.
Yes.
They don't have the fiscal system necessary to provide the social supports, which are mainly at the local government level. But the local governments don't have the revenue to support this. And the model by which local governments raise revenue through property development is as we've seen right now, is not worth, is not viable. So how are you going to provide the hospitals, the pensions, the improved education levels that people want? This is a huge challenge for them.
And also they need to your point about high savings, is because they just put their money in property because they view that as a safe asset.
Right.
There's not a lot of diversified assets for which the Chinese household savings is multiple trillions of dollars. There's a lot of money if you can tap into that savings pool, but they just put it into housing.
Yeah, yeah.
I would add a fourth D, and it would be deteriorating foreign relations, which
Yes.
I think
Yes.
I think
4 Ds.
Yeah,
Yes,
I mean, just look at what just happened to Russia. Okay, just look at this. Obviously, different situation. The U.S. Russian economies are not anywhere near the level of economic integration and relationship. But you can see a situation where we have a China where the Chinese Communist Party and the leadership are being driven by goals that are not the kind of goals that you would have in a market-driven economy, okay? And so you have to understand that they view a lot of their economy, whether they're specific state-owned entities or national champions that aren't state-owned that they want to influence, they see them as tools to further Chinese Communist Party interests, okay? And so as we see a deteriorating foreign relations, Chinese ability to interact with the international economy can become constrained. If you look at 2020, okay, 2000, China had a GDP of 1.2 trillion. That's pretty big. That was the year they entered into the World Trade Organization. And when that happened, they were able to get permanent market access to countries all over the world, okay, especially the United States, the EU, where they had enjoyed a lot of market access, but it wasn't permanent. It wasn't something that, it was something that had to be renewed every year, where they would get preferential duty treatment, where they could bring things in at a low duty rate. In 2000, they came to the WTO. They were able to get permanent certainty that they'd be able to export to the United States. And so what did you see? I mean, this is pretty normal. You saw a lot of manufacturing go to China, because now it could be a permanent hub. China had all kinds of regulatory arbitrage they could do, no labor unions, forced labor in some instances, very low environmental regulations, right? These aren't really competitive advantages, right? These are kind of manufactured advantages. And you see China's GDP go from 1.2 trillion in 2000, when they entered the WTO, to 15 trillion in 2020. And they're correlated, right? There's a lot of causation, right? I don't want to say that all of that growth came from entry into the WTO, but a lot of they are export dependent in a lot of ways. A lot of their employment and the way they keep folks employed and the way they keep peace among the populations by having people have a job, including in factories where there's overcapacity, where they don't need that capacity, so they dump that on the global markets. And so as you see deteriorated financial or economic relations, if they start to lose that access, or at least lose the certainty, you'll see what we're seeing now, what I see now with some clients, where they're setting up a second supply chain. Maybe they're staying in China, maybe they're getting out, maybe they're moving to Indonesia, maybe they're setting up 2 supply chains, and they have to take that into account.
And that is a perfect segue, Jamieson. So let's stay on U.S. China trade for just a little bit. So exports, and China has been a net exporter to the United States for as long as I can remember. I've looked into data back into the 1980s. For as long as I can see, we've run basically a deficit with China, bilateral deficit when it comes to trade of goods, right? Services is a different story, but when it comes to goods. And we all know that trade politics often enters into U.S.-China relations, whether it's Congress and so on. But I don't think we've ever gotten to perhaps a full-fledged trade war, and you were there, so...
I call it a trade dispute.
Trade dispute, okay. Whatever label you want to slap on it, it's certainly the most intensified trade conflict we've had with China in my memory. So why don't you take us through sort of the rationale, sort of how we got to where we did a few years ago?
Sure. No, I'm happy to do that. It really starts with something we call the Section 301 investigation. When the Trump administration took office, pretty quickly there was a concern, a bipartisan concern, that there was forced technology transfer going on with China and U.S. companies. And there are lots of ways it can happen, right? It can be through kind of the headline grabbing, hacking, right? Cyber intrusions, and that's a real thing. There was a lot of ways that if you wanted to have a JV, or if you wanted to operate in the Chinese economy, in the market, you wanted to build there and sell there, the Chinese government would require you to have a JV partner, right? Sometimes it was state-owned, sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes as part of that, you had to turn over your IP or license it. And soon you saw this IP bleeding out. And if you went over with a factory, you'd see a copycat factory pop up across the street. Similar machinery, same plans, sometimes the same trademarks on the equipment. And so there was a big concern about this. And so the U.S. government undertook a study, and all kinds of folks participated in this, business, unions, civil society, and they gave examples of this. And so after several months of study, we came out with a report essentially saying, yes, this is a problem. It's an unfair trade burden. The World Trade Organization, where we typically would take a trade complaint, it doesn't cover some of these issues. However, we have trade laws on the books in the United States that say if the World Trade Organization can't address some of these issues, then the president can take action. And there was a quantification where government economists said, well, we think at least there's a $40 billion cost to this forced technology transfer. It's probably higher than that. If you look at the Huntsman Commission paper on IP, it's pretty high. And so the administration said, well, we are going to then impose, 40, or maybe it's $50 billion worth of tariffs on imported goods from China in an effort to force them to change these practices. Anyway, I won't go on about it, but China's response was not to change its practices, it was to put on their own tariffs. So instead of sitting down and having this discussion, I don't think the Chinese thought we were actually going to follow through with the tariffs. I think they were very surprised by that, but we did. And then there was some tit for tat until finally we were able to have some very serious discussions with Vice Premier Liu He and his team, who worked together with our team in a what I thought was a constructive way. And we ended up with a phase 1 agreement that kind of put everything on ice. We reduced the tariffs a little bit. They agreed to change a lot of their non-tariff barriers with respect to financial services, agriculture. I mean, I talked to some folks earlier yesterday in the agriculture sector who said that their exports to China increased substantially, because of this deal, and not just because there were purchase commitments, but really because China agreed to change some of its agricultural standards. Things which are in their interest, right? I mean, this goes to the point that people have said there are going to be areas where we can cooperate, and it might not look exactly how we do trade with the UK or the EU, but maybe it's going to look a little bit different. Maybe there'll be an aspect of managed trade. Export controls are going to cause challenges, but there's always going to be some element of trade, and we need to manage it very carefully.
Okay, so we're going to end on the phase 1 agreement because I'm getting the wrap-up sign. We only have 35 minutes to cover a lot of territory. So consider this the phase 1 conversation. It doesn't end here. Come and find us. I'm sure we'll all be happy to answer questions that you may have had throughout the session afterwards. So thank you so much, Mary, and thank you, Jamieson.
Thank you, Jamie.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
I wish there was more time for these insightful conversations that we're having. This morning, we have gained some important insights on China's current position in the world as a geopolitical and economic power and what that means for the United States and beyond. It's largely been macro. We've talked about the